Joe, now we're joined by the former Conservative leader Michael Howard, the former Labour MP Jim Knight, he's still a minister, and the former Lib Dem MP Evan Harris, who's joined us from Oxford, a trio of formers. Let's start with the biggest former, the former leader of the Conservative Party. How far, in your view, how far should Mr Cameron go in offering a mechanism to electoral reform?
Well, as you would probably expect me to say, Andrew, I'm not here to draw up David Cameron's negotiating
No, I'm asking for your view.
For him. He's in the negotiations, I'm not.
I mean, he's probably not even listening. I know that's unusual.
And I think that there's a great difficulty about this whole discussion, which is that people talk about proportional representation as though we're talking about one system which everyone is agreed on as an alternative to our existing system. You know, the system which Labour are putting forward would have led to an even bigger Labour majority in the elections of 1997 and 2001 and 2005. And, you know, the only totally fair system is the system they have in Israel, where you get 10% of the votes, you get 10% of the seats, 20% of the votes, 20% of the seats, no constituencies, gives minorities, small extremist parties, wholly disproportionate power. It's a disaster. Right. So there's a lot of loose talk about it. I
can see you're going to get lost in detail rather than answer the question, aren't you?
Well,
let me ask you another one. What do you make of the Lib Dems going behind your party's back and speaking to Labour?
Well, I don't know whether it is indeed behind the party's back. I don't know whether David knew about this. I find it, I must say, I find the prospect, after everything that's happened, after everything that's been said, of the Liberal Democrats propping up Gordon Brown in Downing Street, pretty incredible.
All right, let's go to Evan Harris in Oxford. What do you think the Lib Dems would need from the Conservatives on electoral reform to clinch this deal?
It's hard to judge. I mean, I think Nick Robinson's piece was absolutely right. What he said was absolutely right, that giving a parliament elected on first past the post a veto on whether there would even be a referendum to put before the people would be seen for what it is, which is no electoral reform. The interesting question is whether, if that is Paddy Ashdown's view, the view that it doesn't matter if you don't get a clear commitment to electoral reform, you have to show that three-party politics works and you can have stable government, particularly at a time of crisis, whether that would be persuasive of the Liberal Democrat Parliamentary Party and the Liberal Democrats. And I genuinely don't know the answer to that question, and I'm not sure I would, even if I was still an MP.
But what would be enough? I mean, if the Tories said, look, we'll give you a free vote on a referendum on electoral reform.
I've already said, I said, giving a parliament elected under one system the ability to veto moving to another system where many of them wouldn't be elected, exactly as Nick Robinson said. There's a number of Labour Party members who are against any electoral reform, and there are others who might support it if it meant that they'd hold their seat, and they wouldn't know what was going to happen. That's a nothing. That's not.
Well, how could you have a referendum if the current Parliament doesn't vote for it? You need a referendum act. So by definition, it's the existing Parliament that has to determine the referendum.
So if there's a majority agreed in terms of a stable government that would be sufficient to vote through the legislation and the legislation for a referendum which would confirm the change, then that's one thing. But a free vote means that there is obviously no majority. You know that. So all I'm saying is that option of a free vote would be transparently no electoral reform and would be seen, I think, as, this is my personal view, as insulting to the intelligence of Liberal Democrats. Right. It would be better to have the Paddy system, the Paddy idea, which might work, about showing that you can work without insisting. But there's such a big build-up in the country now for electoral reform, not to the exclusion of dealing with the economic crisis, that I think it would be hard, even for a popular Nick Clegg, to sell that through.
All right. Well, my other two guests are labouring under a difficulty there, Mr. Harris. They can't hear what you're saying. They are both expert lip readers. and probably
they know what I'm saying.
But they can't hear what you're saying. I'm sure they know what you're saying. Jim Knight, you lost your seat. But you're still a government minister under the way things go.
Slightly weirdly.
Did you, you're in kind of dress down Friday mode though. Did you go into the office this morning?
No, I'm planning to go in to get my belongings a bit later on.
You're not going to do anything? You've still got a department to run, have you not?
Well,
care and maintenance?
We are currently in Purda, so no decisions are being made unless they're exceptional, and in the end that's what ministers do.
Letters to sign, papers to sign, things like that?
No, I'm not expecting to have to sign anything.
All right. Where do you think your party is in this sort of strange coalition business that's going on at the moment?
Well, I think at the moment, by default, because there isn't a government, we are the government. So we've got to do what's necessary, and Gordon has to carry on being the Prime Minister until another Prime Minister
I understand
emerges.
that. But are you still players in... We know that Mr Clegg would like to do a deal with the Conservatives. That's his first choice. But he isn't really now doing a deal with you. Could he do one and Gordon... What has to change? Does Mr Brown have to step aside? Even if not as Prime Minister, as Labour leader, to facilitate a deal with the Lib Dems?
Well, obviously, the first thing is that Nick Clegg's got to decide that there's not a deal to be done with the Tories, and I think he needs to get on with it, because people are losing patience with this whole process. And then if he decides there isn't a deal, and if he's had preliminary discussions, as it would appear he has, with the Labour Party, then those very quickly need to be resolved, because I don't think we can carry on much longer. And if they can't, then we have to step aside and let a minority Tory government be formed under David Cameron.
If you'd got rid of Gordon Brown, do you think you'd have saved your seat?
That's a really difficult one to call.
I know, that's why I asked it.
In 2005, when I knocked on doors, Tony Blair was pretty unpopular because of Iraq, and
you won, though.
And I won. This time, Gordon was pretty unpopular because the Tory press weren't giving him a good time, and it was a very presidential sort of election, and everything personified around Gordon.
I know the Tory press wasn't helpful, but I don't think that's the only reason you could say that Mr Brown was unpopular.
Can I make a point, Andrew? Jim says we've got to get on with it. You were complaining at the head of the programme that we're in the 4th day after the election. We don't know.
Not complaining, just pointing out.
Pointing out. Peter Riddle did a study last week looking at systems of proportional representation in other countries across the board. The average time it took to make a form a government after the election, taking the whole piece, was 40 days.
But isn't it because of the
not
economy,
4,
though, that the pressure is on because of the situation?
Well,
40 days and 40 nights.
40
Very
days.
biblical.
Time for a trip into the desert.
Exactly.
Andrew, Joe's right that the economy is the reason why people are losing patience. And, Michael, your party issued an invitation for people to join the UK government on the front page of its manifesto. They then redefined it during the campaign to say, as long as you're not a Liberal Democrat. Now they're saying, but we do want them to be Liberal Democrats.
Did you get the invite? I got the invite.
I didn't get the invite.
I'm very keen that a deal should be done. I'm entirely supportive of the effort.
Well, yes.
All right, Evan Davis.
Well, Evan Harris, but,
I beg your pardon.
I'm looking for work, so if I can be his...
I'll have a word with the other Evan then. He may be able to job share.
I think the idea that people are losing patience it has to be tested. I mean, the media are watching every move because we're simply not used to, in this country, the electorate effectively deciding, not as a coherent decision, but the end result, that no single party should govern alone. And if the biggest party got only 7% of the vote, and that was with everything in its favour, then I think we ought to respect the British people and say this is going to take time. Nothing is collapsing, and I think there's scare stories around this. I agree that 40 days would seem long, but there's no reason why this couldn't be done within this week. And can I say that I understand that David Cameron knew that Nick Clegg was meeting Gordon Brown, so I don't think you need to argue that there's any mischief making going
No, this
on.
was a separate meeting Nick Robinson was talking about, but never mind. You mentioned the people. Let's hear from them, Joe.
Yes, because I think some of them are, I mean, this obviously not necessarily represented. These are people that have written into the BBC who are getting frustrated about the fact that there hasn't been a decision made.
If they're not angry, they won't write, will they?
Well, no, that's true. Pat Thomas says we must have another election as soon as possible. I feel I've been fooled by the Liberal Democrats. I've been a Labour supporter most of my life, but this time I thought it might be better to vote Liberal Democrat as they share so many of Labour's ideas. What happens? They turn to the Tories, the last people I would vote for. This from Helen in Aberdeen. I've been a lifelong Liberal Democrat supporter, and I cannot believe what I'm seeing. Becoming a lapdog for the Conservative government will be catastrophic for the party. And this from Stephen. Enough of this deal-making. Rerun the election. Tory voters voted for Tory policies, not Lib Dem ones. And finally, this from a man in the Isle of Wight. Gordon Brown's and the Labour Party's efforts to scupper attempts by David Cameron to form a government are shameful after losing the election so badly.
So, Evan Harris, problems all round.
Yeah, well, clearly, and I've said this in the Times this morning,